Okay, so welcome everyone. Panelists, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Uncovering Agriculture's Climate Impacts. This is the first in a series of webinars hosted by the Food and Farming Journalism Network for journalists covering or wanting to report on the industrial food system. This first webinar is about climate. And before I hand the mic over to Jenny Splitter of Sentient, and she's your host for today, I wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and everything that you learned today is on the record. And following our panelists' presentations, we'll host a 20-minute Q&A. You'll see a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so please put your questions in there as they come up during the webinar, and Jenny will pose those questions to our panelists after their presentation. Many of you today are already members of the Food and Farming Journalism Network, but if you're not, and if you're a journalist and you'd like to join a community of other journalists reporting on food and farming, then please consider joining. In addition to this webinar series, we also offer monthly informal Zoom gatherings that feature short presentations on topics related to food and farming and its impact on climate, the environment, rural communities, public health, working conditions, and animal welfare. We also host an active Slack channel where members share resources, story ideas, and get help and advice from each other in their reporting. And I'll drop a link into the chat shortly where you can learn more and sign up. And now I'm going to turn the show over to Sentient's editor-in-chief, Jenny Splitter.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks all the attendees for being here today. I'm really excited to have this conversation and to get to all your questions. So do put them in the Q&A. I am editor-in-chief of Sentient. We're the only nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet solely dedicated to the factory farm beat. And I'm going to have each of our panels introduce themselves. Jonathan Foley, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, good morning, good day, wherever you are. Hi, I'm John Foley. I'm the Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is a world-leading resource for climate solutions, and we're nonpartisan, non-commercial, and science-based kind of resource for climate action. I myself am a climate scientist. I spent many years at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota in academia. Then I did a little detour running a science museum in San Francisco, the California Academy of Sciences. And for the last 6 or so years, I've been the head of Project Drawdown. And I'm very, very happy to give a little presentation, probably be about 15 minutes, talking about kind of the basics of why food ends up being a real big climate problem and where we might want to focus our efforts according to the science. So I'll start that and then be really happy to hear questions and conversation later. But let me share a few slides with y'all. Oh, and I'm calling in from the Stillwater, Minnesota area outside of Minneapolis. Okay, well, I think a lot of people are kind of surprised to learn that the food we eat and the farms that grow it and all the land we clear in the process are a big environmental problem across the planet. And basically, it boils down to one really essential fact is the food system is really big. There's essentially nothing else we've done as a species that rivals food in terms of shaping the nature of this planet. And when I say that, I really mean it. Just look at the extent of farmland in the world today. If we look at cropland, the land that grows our crops, obviously, that includes things like wheat and rice and corn and soybeans, but all the way to carrots and blueberries and all the little plants that we like to eat, or we feed our cows and sometimes we feed our cars. That's about 16 million square kilometers of land if we put it all together. In fact, if we put it all in one single place, it'd be about the same size as South America, just to put things in perspective. But that's actually the smaller part of our food system. An even larger part is our grazing land, the pastures and rangelands that we let our critters go out and go chew on the grass and the forbs out there. That's mainly cattle, but includes sheep and goats and lots of other things too. So when we put it together, the land we use to raise plants and the area we use to raise animals covers 38% of all the land on Earth. And as Mark Twain said, we're not making any more of it. So about 40% in round numbers of all the land on the planet is used for food. To put that in perspective, all the cities and suburbs and concrete and everything else we call sprawl in the world is actually a lot less than 1%. So for every acre of cities and suburbs and sprawl in the world, there's about 60 acres of farming in the world. Now, of that 38% of all the land in the world used for food, 29 of that 39% is used for animal-based agriculture. Obviously, that's all the grazing land, the kind of reddish orange stuff on this map, but it also includes a significant fraction of our cropland. Just think of the Midwestern US, for example, like how much of that corn and soybeans isn't feeding people, it's feeding mainly cows, but also quite a few cars. So a big share of our cropland and all of that grazing land is used for the animal side of agriculture, and that obviously is going to be a big part of the story. But with this much land, and in parallel, we have about even more of our water use tied up in agriculture, we see massive environmental impacts from our agricultural and food systems. First and foremost, clearing this much land clears whole ecosystems from the face of the earth. Their entire biomes have been essentially eradicated, like the North American prairie doesn't basically exist anymore. It's mostly corn and soybeans. And with that, we lose tremendous amounts of biodiversity and just ecosystem health all around the world. But also, agriculture is the biggest user of water at about 70% of all the water consumption on Earth. Actually, maybe more like 85% if you call it consumptive use versus withdrawals. But that's a technical detail. Agriculture is also the biggest source of water pollution in the world, mainly through fertilizers. And the pollution of waterways with nitrogen and phosphorus compounds is a huge problem for water quality and health, but also ecosystems and even all the way to the oceans. And overall, our farming today, through clearing land, losing soil, using up water, and polluting waterways and watersheds, is leading to major ecosystem declines all across the world. So even if that were the problem, it would be huge. But that's not all. It turns out the food system is also a big contributor to climate change. We don't think about this very much. Most of the times we think about climate change, we think about smokestacks and tailpipes and fossil fuels and all that stuff, and that's a big part of the story. But a big part of the story is also the food system. And when we zoom in and see that the food system contributes about 22% directly, just growing food and clearing land, just directly, 22% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. Turns out it's even more than that. I'll explain in a minute. But directly, the food system contributes to climate change through basically four big areas. The first and foremost is deforestation. About 11% of that 22 comes from deforestation. To put that in perspective, the United States emits about 10% of the world's greenhouse gases. Deforestation emits even more. Deforestation is mainly for clearing land for food, primarily cattle in places like Brazil, but also for animal feed in the form of soybeans, also in the greater Amazon region, for example, but also for things like palm oil and other commodities around the world. But those are the big three: beef, animal feed, and palm oil are driving most of that 11% of the emissions coming from deforestation. Deforestation, I think, is probably the number one big issue in climate change, and it gets almost no attention. Another big source we all joke about, of course, is the methane coming from livestock. These animals digest food differently than we do. They have different chambered stomachs, as ruminants and also ungulates can digest things that we can't, but in the process of doing that, they release methane. Fun fact, animals like this burp methane. They don't fart a lot of extra methane. So if you learned anything today, that's probably the one people like to remember the most. But those burping cows all over the world release about 5% of greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change in the form of methane. Then we have the farming of croplands around the world, especially industrial farming methods that use too much fertilizer and till the land too much. That's another 3%. A lot of that comes from nitrous oxide released from soils that are like kind of hyper fertilized, far more than the plants can use, which leads to greenhouse gas emissions and, it turns out, water pollution as well. And then to round it out, the last 2% or so of this comes from methane again, but this time from rice fields. Rice fields are grown in kind of flooded conditions where they go anaerobic and release methane from the kind of rotting organic matter in those wet soils. So again, to kind of wrap this kind of sector up, what we see again is about 22% of emissions directly from food, mainly deforestation, methane from animals, industrial farming, especially fertilizers, and methane from rice. But food touches all those other sectors as well, not just growing food and clearing land, but we have to refrigerate food, we have to cook food, we transport food, we throw food away and put it in landfills. And those emissions are counted somewhere else. Like refrigerating foods counted in electricity for the power needed in refrigeration, but the refrigerants themselves turn out to be a powerful greenhouse gas too, and that's counted over in the industry column. Landfills and wastewater, where food waste ultimately goes, is in the industry column as well. Food miles, which are not that big a deal, but they're over in transportation, and so on and so on. So when we talk about food, we have to look at the direct emissions from growing food and clearing land at 22%, but all those other emissions kind of push it up closer to 34%. So roughly speaking, that's a third of climate change caused by our food system. And today it gets about 3% of the climate funding to solve climate change, a tenfold gap in ambition. So, how might we approach cutting these emissions and stopping climate change from the food sector lens? Well, the first thing we got to do is cut the pollution at the source. And we can cut those emissions with four different approaches. First and foremost, and the most effective far and away, is to just start with a more efficient food system because our food system is incredibly inefficient today. We lose and waste enormous amounts of food in the world today. It's estimated that about 30 to 40% of all the food on Earth is never eaten, either lost in the field or wasted by the consumer. And so cutting that obviously would cut emissions. Most of those emissions we cut would be in the growing of the food, upstream of our plates. But some of those emissions are downstream of our plates if we throw food away from our homes into a landfill. So about 20% of food waste emissions are in the landfills, and that's where composting can help. But 80% of the emissions are upstream in the rainforest we clear, or the fertilizers we use, or the beef emissions we have, etc. But not only do we have to tackle food loss and waste, which is kind of a no-brainer, we also have to confront the issue of diets. And it's just a mathematical fact. And there's no way around this. I know a lot of people want to argue about this, but the science is extremely clear that some foods emit more greenhouse gases than others, mostly in the production of it. So when we look at the different foods that emit different levels of greenhouse gases, you're going to notice something right away, that meat and dairy products are always at the top of the list. And beef is way off the charts compared to any other food, even other meats. So we have a disproportionate impact of climate change from just one kind of food, beef. Now, to put this in perspective, it's kind of crazy, but we usually think of coal as the biggest polluting thing when it comes to climate change. If I burn 1 pound of coal, it releases about 2 to 4 pounds of CO2, depending how I mined the coal. But it turns out beef is way bigger than that. Producing 1 pound of beef on this planet today, on average, releases about 100 pounds of CO2 for every pound of beef, 100 to 1. It's 50 to 25 times more polluting than coal. Beef is, in fact, a super polluter of climate change, and there's just no way around this. So curbing excessive beef consumption, especially, but other kinds of meat as well, can have a pretty big lever in the food and climate system. So we're going to have to talk about it. Another big area to focus on, of course, is not just having a more efficient food system, but then deliberately doing things like protecting ecosystems, especially rainforest and deforestation. I told you before that most of the deforestation we see right now is driven by beef, animal feed, palm oil. And if we stop deforestation for those commodities, we keep carbon locked up in forest, which is great. So protecting forests is a crucial climate solution. We can also improve farming methods, in particular how we approach the questions of fertilizer use and tillage. Whether it's organic or so-called regenerative or whatever, or maybe more precision industrial ag. All of those could be used, and maybe in combination, to do things like reduce the amount of excessive fertilizers being used in the Midwest, Europe, India, China, those huge purple places on this map. We can cut that dramatically and cut back nitrous oxide emissions that cause a little part of climate change, but also a lot of water pollution. And there are huge opportunities. All those areas in yellow and orange are places we estimate could have tremendous kind of pullbacks of fertilizer use without sacrificing yields. And those are some big fat opportunities in China, India, Europe, the US, and so on. And we can also clean up the larger food system, especially tuning up our refrigeration and cold chains. That's probably the biggest lever. Reducing food waste helps reduce the industrial emissions from landfills. Food miles are a little less important than some people think, but that's important too. And other places we can chip away at to clean up all those other parts of the food system are right there too. So putting it together by starting with a more efficient food system by tackling waste and diets, protecting things like rainforest, farming better, and fixing up the rest of the food system, we have a lot of ways to cut emissions, and that's great. We also, in addition to cutting emissions, which is our jobs number 1, 2, 3, and 4, we can also do a little bit of carbon removal. Now, we often get distracted by this and love to talk about it, but I'll tell you right now, a lot of this is pretty overhyped. Removing carbon in agriculture is kind of like removing carbon in fossil fuels. We hear about clean coal, we hear about carbon capture, stuff like that, but it's sometimes a distraction from cutting the bloody emissions in the first place. Same thing in food. We've got to cut the emissions in the first place, and then we can talk about removing carbon as a secondary step, but not in place of a primary step. And the best way to remove carbon is to restore nature, shrink the footprint of agriculture and put back the forest, put back the natural prairies, put back the mangroves. If we could do that through curbing our diets and curbing our waste, that would be a great, great idea. We also, though, have a lot of excitement around regenerative agriculture. But again and again, when scientists look at this, not film producers or advocates of regenerative agriculture, but when scientists actually look at the data, they come back pretty skeptical. Because time and time again, we're finding that the results of real field trials replicated at scale aren't producing the results we see in the movies. And that there are also risk, because these buildup of soil isn't necessarily permanent, and it does eventually saturate. So if you don't cherry pick the data and you look at it more systematically, regenerative grazing in particular doesn't look quite as strong as it might at first appear. It might be there, but be careful here, because some of this has been overhyped a lot. Nonetheless, we, in addition to cutting emissions, really do think that removing carbon is helpful, especially by rewilding what we can, and then using regenerative ag on the lands we still farm, but mostly as a secondary step. But altogether, we have a very powerful portfolio of, kind of cutting the emissions, removing a little bit of carbon, and I think that presents an incredible opportunity for us to work on multiple fronts together, synergistically, and all of them, I think, can actually help us build a better food system in general. Not just for climate change, but for water, for soil, for land, for us, for animals, for the planet. But to do that, we're going to have to follow the science, follow the evidence, even when it's unpleasant and doesn't, resonate with our values sometimes. But we have to follow the evidence. Otherwise, we're going to get misled by our feelings and by people who manipulate us. And we're going to have to learn how to collaborate better and stop polarizing and tearing this all apart, I think, and find ways to maybe find some win-wins here, or at least some manageable trade-offs that can get us to where we want to go. And in the process, maybe unlock a much better future for us and the planet along the way. So I'll stop here, and thanks so much for your attention today. I really appreciate it.
Great, that was fantastic. And I see some questions coming in, so keep those coming. We're going to go to Helen next. Just introduce yourself first, and then go ahead and start your presentation.
Thanks, Jenny. And first of all, just a huge thanks to the team at Sentient for putting this webinar on. Really appreciate it. I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for everybody for joining today. So I'm Helen Harwatt. I've worked on climate research and policy for the past 22 years. And for the past 12 years of that, I've been fully focused on food systems. Most of that 22 years has been spent in academic institutes doing scientific research. And most recently, that was at Harvard Law School. And I've spent the past 5 years at an international affairs think tank called Chatham House in the UK. And I'm currently a senior consultant specializing on research, strategy, and policy in food system transformation. So I'm just going to share some slides. Try again. Does this look good?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. So I'm going to focus today on aligning the livestock sector with the Paris Agreement and mainly draw on a recent report that I did with a super bunch of colleagues. And that really focuses on the why, when, where, and how of aligning the livestock sector with the Paris Agreement. So first of all, just to take a step back and look at the global climate picture. So we know that globally emissions need to peak this year, ideally, to give us the best chance of aligning with 1.5 degrees or not going above that. We also need much greater action before 2030 and a reduction of around 43% in global emissions by 2030. So these are huge reductions that are needed really soon. We really need to reduce the pace of global temperature increase. And this is largely in relation to avoiding ecosystem destabilization and potentially cascading risks and tipping points related to that. We need to reduce our dependence on unproven technology. And here I'm mainly referring to bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And we can only really do that by by taking much greater action now and not relying on those unproven technologies, which would be really disastrous. So we know we need unprecedented change to meet the climate challenges and targets ahead of us. And this really requires major change from all sectors. Much of the focus has been on the energy sector, but we really need to take strong action on agriculture as well. The livestock sector is also a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, somewhere around 16.5%, and on its current trajectory could use around half of the budget aligning with 1.5 degrees by 2030. So we can see from these numbers that the livestock sector does need to be a part of climate action, but what we're not fully sure about is to what extent, when, and how that action should happen. So we surveyed a set of climate scientists and agricultural experts. So these are mostly people who have co-authored IPCC assessment reports. And our final sample was around 210 climate scientists and agricultural experts from 48 different countries. And what we really wanted to focus on here is if we should align the livestock sector with the Paris Agreement, when, where, and how should that be done? So the experts agreed that livestock emissions should be reduced as much as possible to reduce the risk of going over 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, to reduce the risk of relying on negative emissions technologies such as BECCS, as we've mentioned, and to contribute a fair share of global emissions reductions. They also agree that emissions should peak as soon as possible from the livestock sector everywhere, and more specifically that they should peak globally by 2025 and in high-income and middle-income countries by 2025 and fall rapidly after that peaking. And they should peak after 2030 in low-income countries. So it was quite interesting there to see that difference between the different income, the country income groups coming through in the responses from experts, which I thought was really logical and good to see. So in terms of global targets, the experts recommend a 50% reduction in livestock emissions by 2030, followed by a 61% reduction by 2036, and also a peak in absolute livestock numbers by 2025. So we wanted to get more insight into what that actually looks like in terms of the trajectory of emissions reductions from the peak in 2025 down to the reduction, the 61% reduction in 2036. So you can see here, these are the trajectories that we asked about in the survey, and the thickness demonstrates the ones that were thought to most align with the Paris Agreement. So you can see that the green one, that is what we call front-loaded. So at least 50% of that end target in 2036 would be achieved within 5 years after peak emissions. And the second most popular one was this steady decline, which is basically an even reduction between the peak and the end goal. What you'll also see here is this red line. So that is essentially the 2030 and 2035 global greenhouse gas reduction goals that are needed to align with 1.5 degrees. So that's global emissions reductions. And you can see from our survey that the most well-aligned pathway with what's needed at the global level is this far front-loaded, where at least 75% of the end goal would be achieved within 5 years after peak emissions. We also asked the experts how those emissions should be reduced. And you can see here on the left, this is where the very large contributions would be coming from. And the two most effective measures were reducing the production and consumption of livestock products. The two least effective measures were soil carbon sequestration, so think regenerative grazing, and also the intensification of livestock production. I thought these results were really interesting because it's these two, the soil carbon and the intensification, that really sort of dominate the popular narrative in terms of what's going to be needed in the livestock sector. Whereas our survey of experts is actually showing that's not the case at all, quite the opposite. We also asked what the implications of a Paris compliant livestock sector would be for consumers. So we can see here that in low-income countries, for example, their diets would shift to being slightly more plant-based than they currently are. In middle-income countries and globally, they would be quite a bit more plant-based than they currently are. And in high-income countries, they would need to be much more plant-based than they currently are. So the policy options that the experts agreed were that best available food should be given preference in climate policy, agricultural policy, and also in food procurement policy. So just to take a step back and explain the best available food concept, I introduced this in a publication in 2018. And it essentially is adapted from the pollution control strategy of best available technology. So you basically identify the most suitable replacements for livestock products assessed against a range of criteria, including emissions and other environmental impacts, such as water and land use, and also public health impacts as well. Another side note on best available foods is that I think it's really important to be realistic and try and describe what we actually mean by best available foods and not sort of let people's imaginations run away with them on this. I think it's really, we're not implying hardship with this best available food strategy. And just to give a shout out to pulses, which I always like to do, they will be very important in this kind of a shift. So back to the report, some key recommendations that the experts also laid out. So greenhouse gas reduction targets should be done globally and for countries, high-income countries and middle-income countries. Greenhouse gas reductions must also be achieved without increasing the number of farmed animals. So that would preclude a sort of beef to chicken type shift where you would actually increase the number of farmed animals overall, or at the cost of animal welfare. So I think further intensification, for example. So where needed, climate finance mechanisms would assist farmers to transition away from livestock production, and carbon sinks could be restored on land no longer used for animal agriculture, and that could also be assisted by climate finance mechanisms. There's some reports that we included as authors in the report. So the first one was to declare for national policymakers to declare a peak livestock timeframe appropriate to their country income level, revise nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement accordingly, and also to align that with biodiversity frameworks and pledges as well, so they're not at odds with each other and they're actually well coordinated and aligned. Also, using climate change and biodiversity funding streams seems like it's going to be a really important aspect of this transition, and related to that, aligning agricultural subsidies with these goals and investing in agricultural alternatives to livestock production. We also recommended conducting national food system assessments. Some countries are already doing that or starting to do that, and also considering those plans, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also land use, biodiversity and public health. And finally, to account for food trade, so we don't have a situation where countries are very much focused on national or territorial impacts and sort of offshore their impacts of continued or increased consumption elsewhere in the world. I also just wanted to flag some follow-up reports that we're doing from this survey, just in case anyone is interested in this topic and would like to sort of keep in touch on these forthcoming analyses. So we have one coming this year where we've essentially taken that Paris compliant livestock scenario from the survey and assessed what impact that would have on global temperature. And this is very much due to the impact of methane reduction in the short term. As John just pointed out, it's a very powerful climate greenhouse gas, and it has a very strong impact in the short term. And we're finding some really impressive results from this scenario in terms of the reduction in global temperature in the short term. We're also doing an analysis or publishing an analysis of the impacts of a Paris compliant livestock sector in HICs and MICs on low income countries. So what would the impact be on low income countries via trade if such extensive impacts were happening in HICs and MICs? We're also publishing a global country income group and national pathway assessment of a Paris compliant food system by 2030. So that's quite a big kind of all-encompassing analysis, which will look at impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, land use, biodiversity and carbon sinks. And also we assess in that the impacts on the global biodiversity framework, and specifically for the 23 goals under that for 2030. And that'll be coming out later this year, somewhere around COP30. We're also looking at an assessment of the impact on livestock numbers by different types in different parts of the world of these Paris compliant scenarios, and a more broader look at stranded assets related to food system transformation. So quite a lot coming this year. It's going to be very busy, and do keep in touch if any of that sounds of interest. I just wanted to mention that I think what's also needed to really kind of progress policy and narrative on food system transformation, specifically the livestock sector, is a vision of what that transformed system and sector looks like. So this really needs to be inclusive of the societal and landscape level impacts. I think that's so important for people to sort of, we know the numbers, we've seen the numbers, we have a lot of insight into that, but what does that actually look like on the ground? What would that implementation mean for your sort of everyday life? And we've already done a little bit of work on this. So back in 2019, we published a report that looked at the UK. And we looked at what the impacts would be of returning grazing land back to native forest cover in the UK. And I just want to draw your attention here to exactly what I just mentioned, this landscape level impact. So you can see here all of the green colouring would basically be new forest cover in the UK, and you can get an idea there of the level of impacts that would have on pretty much everybody in the country in terms of access to those forest areas for recreation and mental health benefits, also green spaces as well, and other benefits such as air pollution and flood protection, for example. So there's a whole host of impacts for society from these landscape level changes that I think we really need to focus more on in this conversation. We also did a similar analysis at the global level, which we published in 2020. And again, just want to draw your attention to, so this is essentially showing where the new vegetation would be if land use for animal agriculture was returned to its native vegetation cover, which would be forest or grassland in this scenario. And you can again get a feel here for how much more green space that would actually create. Very, very different to the current situation. So just to wrap up with some final thoughts, livestock reduction is certainly not a single issue, such as animal advocacy, for example, and I think sort of pigeonholing it into these single issues really isn't helpful for because it really does impact many aspects of our lives, environment, and economies. And we should really be thinking about this problem and its solution from a holistic perspective, including those societal and landscape level changes that I was just talking about. And also just to point out again that intensification and soil carbon sequestration or regenerative grazing really do not solve the problem. Thanks so much for listening.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we have a lot of questions already, so I'm going to jump right in and I think be a little cheeky and combine a few, which is that I see a question about permaculture, one about the need to farm with nature, not against it, and another about precision agriculture. So I feel like that kind of reflects one of my attention that I think is very interesting, which is just like, you know, is technology, or the solutions kind of in technology? And you mentioned intensification, Helen, we both kind of nodded at it. And then also just sort of kind of at the opposite, going, you know, more farming with nature. So how would both of you kind of think about these two things? Maybe they aren't in tension at all, you know, maybe that's a false framing. So yeah, what do you, or I guess for reporters, what would you suggest in terms of those two ideas, like how to kind of think about them in our reporting? Jonathan, do you want to start? Sorry, and then we'll go to Helen.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess two thoughts. Well, three thoughts. One is, yeah, those things are all helpful. Things that leave the soil covered when possible, instead of, bare and exposed and eroding away in the winter or, in the spring or whatever, would be a good idea. And that's kind of farming with nature. And it's also sometimes enabled by precision agriculture, depending how you do it. Using fewer nutrients, especially nitrogen fertilizer, whether that's like organic, permaculture, regenerative, whatever you want to call it, or you are just better at applying chemical fertilizer, and because you have a little sensor and a GPS and a tractor, that's good too. I'm agnostic about how we do this. I think it's the goal, not the label, that matters. So, being reducing the dependence on pesticides, reducing the amount of time the soil is bare, reducing excessive inputs when they're not needed, whether they're organic or permaculture or precision industrial ag. I'm not that interested in the labels. I'm interested in the outcomes. And so I like the idea of blending those approaches where we can. And they all could be significantly helpful. One of the biggest farming practice changes we need to see in the world, though we don't talk about it much, is crop residue burning. Especially in India, some other parts of the world. That's a huge source of soot and other actually greenhouse gases, as well as air pollution. And also the way we farm rice. Could we, not keep it flooded year round and do other kind of systems of rice production that reduce methane emissions? It isn't just American debates about organic versus industrial agriculture in the world. I think we need to kind of step back and look at outcomes and look at blended approaches. But that's just a pragmatic view. But also let's not forget that the biggest levers of all in our analysis and what Helen presented as well, I think, are things like, the demand side. It isn't just the farmer. We always kind of want to pan the camera to the farm, but it's often the supply chains being so wasteful and so filled with loss and waste along the way. And then we're just devoting so much of the food system to our association for meat and dairy products. We could cut that back a lot. And we could also think about our biofuels policies, especially in places like the United States, that are kind of nutty, in my opinion, at least. So, sorry, long answer, but maybe it's all the above, but also keep a bigger window and maybe try to reduce the tribalism of, feels almost like religious wars, of like, well, my interpretation of the gospel is this, therefore I'm going to go to war with you. It's a slightly different interpretation. Like, who cares? It's just look at the goals, not the labels.
Great. Yes. Love all that. Helen, you have any thoughts on some of those terms brought up?
Yeah, I completely agree with John's assessment. I think one thing to kind of add is when we move to like organic, for example, production methods, that tends to require more land than conventional production. So that brings in, again, this need to reduce the overall demand for land. And we can really only do that by shifting towards more plant-based diets and producing less livestock, essentially, whether that's grazing and cropland. But yeah, I think just to add in that point that it's not as simple as just saying we can just do organic, like switch the whole current system to organic, because that's just not an option. It would need to be in combination with a substantial shift to plant-based diets as well.
Okay, there's a question here about, well, actually, there's a few questions about kind of smaller farmers and also just livelihoods in general. And you both, I believe, touched on it, but I guess, yeah, if there's anything else to tease out here in terms of like, I think sometimes in talking about sort of global shifts or sort of the big picture, it can be challenging to report on how that might, impact, say, a small scale farmer. In different countries, obviously, there's different sort of there's different strategies in play, right, in terms of reduction and in terms of transition. So I guess, yeah, is there anything else? Are there like studies or projects you might recommend reporters look at in terms of like what transition might look like for a smaller scale farmer? And I know it really depends on the country. So I guess this is what I'm getting at in my struggle, is this is kind of, I think, what we reporters in this beat struggle with, and that like we want to get across the big picture, and also there are these individual stories where it's going to be complicated, and how to kind of balance that. Like, what should we know about kind of the economics of it for smaller scale farmers? Whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, I can jump in. I'm not sure how helpful this is, but just on the big picture level, first of all, subsidies are hugely important in determining what farmers grow and how. So I think without changing that, it's that's really where the big transformation is going to be in terms of economic levers. It's really restructuring those subsidies to align with the sort of food systems that we need. I think on a smaller scale, that's really interesting. There's some examples, one of them being a company called Hodmedod in the UK, and they're working with lots of crop producers. So some of them have shifted from producing feed crops to human edible crops, which requires some not insignificant shifts in terms of the crop quality, for example. But that's a really interesting set of case studies in terms of what can be grown and on what scale, and the level of profitability of doing that is quite surprising as well. And I think more recently there's been some examples of sort of reusing infrastructure that was sort of there for animal agriculture, so chicken sheds, for example, and shifting them over to mushroom production. I can't remember the name of that company, but I think there's just some interesting examples of these kind of small scale producers cropping up, and I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, I just want to underline what Helen said so well. It's like, the subsidies and, there's a big thumb on the scale of what we call a free market that favors certain kinds of approaches over others. Of course, they just lock in certain kind of, large parts of our food system. I mean, in the United States, we all see this too, the dominance of, corn, but corn doesn't feed anybody directly. It's an incredibly inefficient use of land and water and subsidies and chemicals and environmental damage for what? It's not feeding the world, it's feeding some wallets of a small number of people. And we have to kind of recognize that, or the ridiculous, corn ethanol policies in the US. For every 100 hectares of corn ethanol in America, you could hire, I think, something like 97 of them and put them into prairie, cover 3 with solar panels, and come out ahead on energy production by far. So, we have ridiculous structural kind of subsidies, policies, market kind of distortions that really aren't helping farmers at all, but they're always used as a symbol, as a prop to justify the current system. There aren't any small farmers, to first approximation, left in the United States, for example. There are a few, but for the most part, they were wiped out. But they're still held up in television commercials and in PR stunts and things like this, as kind of this wrap themselves in the flags kind of prop for what's really kind of a big multinational kind of, you know, structure. And, that's out of my lane as a scientist, but it's pretty evident that some parts of the food system aren't really serving farmers well today. And we need to kind of look at the bigger picture of, the overall economy, the overall public good, the overall health of the environment and people and the economy and jobs and everything else. And we're far from an ideal system today. I think we could only make it better because today it's really pretty broken in so many fundamental ways.
Question here about data sources for US deforestation and the role of agriculture compared to urban sprawl and other factors. And you mentioned urban sprawl, Jonathan. So yeah, I guess, is there good data sources you recommend for looking at that?
Yeah, probably the most accessible database for folks to look at for forest trends overall is the World Resources Institute has a really fantastic kind of Forest Watch website that's very scientifically good, well vetted, reasonable, and it's really accessible. But you're going to find in the United States that forests are not being cleared by agriculture for the most part, or frankly, very much by urban sprawl either. What's really happening is forest fires are actually clearing more forests than all of that in California, in the Mountain West, and things like that. And that's not deliberate human activity. We are clearing some land a little bit in the United States still for agriculture, but mainly in the prairie states. In the 90s and 2000s, you saw a bit of clearing of what remained as kind of grasslands in North and South Dakota, for example, turning it into corn because ethanol production was in all the rage. You're seeing some consolidation, but mostly it's swapping out some crops for others, is what you're seeing. And overall, urban sprawl like in the east is maybe intersecting forest a little bit, but most of those forests are recovering from when New England, for example, was covered in agriculture. That was the breadbasket of America, was the Northeast until the Civil War. And then after that, it moved to the Midwest. And now the largest area of regrowing forest on the planet are the Northeastern United States. For example, I grew up in rural Maine, and there are trees growing up through old stone fences and barbed wire, which used to be farms. And so that's actually a pretty big area of regrowing forests today from a legacy from the distant past. So it's a little complicated, but WRI and Forest Watch, I think is the name of the website, would be a good place to look at that. But for the most part, forest loss in the US is forest kind of plantations in the southeast, but also a lot of forest fires to the west and increasingly elsewhere.
Great. And then Helen, you might know this one. How many countries have livestock related targets in their NDCs? Hopefully, you know this one.
Yeah, well, I think they're currently going through another revision ahead of COP30. So yeah, I would probably wait and see what happens, but I wouldn't expect any big changes really. I think it's currently around 12 countries, maybe something, it's very low, which is very shocking, and was another reason why we did our survey to really try and show that these, including a target for the livestock sector, is a really necessary part of an NDC, and currently that's really not happening. And where it is happening, it tends not to be so much of a sector and more of a list of measures that might be taken to reduce livestock emissions, and that tends to be much more focused on some of the technological measures that we've been talking about, and much less about livestock reduction or the reduction of consumption, for example, which we wouldn't necessarily expect to see in an NDC because they do focus on production emissions. I guess just to mention there as well that there is one country, so Denmark now has a plant-based plan. I'm not sure how that is going to be, or if it's going to be factored into their NDC. I'm not sure how that would necessarily be done, but that kind of covers the whole production through to consumption sort of look, and also looks at the kind of financing element as well and the incentives throughout that entire chain. So it seems like the most comprehensive approach to these issues that we've seen so far. But yeah, I'm not sure if that has made it into the NDC in any form.
Maybe just adding to that, not specific to the NDCs, but just wanted to emphasize a point that I think Helen made really well too, and our work shows similarly. But it's really important, like when we talk about shifting to plant-based diets and things, to realize, there's a disproportionate kind of lever in here. It's beef is off the charts compared to all other forms of beef. So substituting even beef for chicken, at least from a climate point of view, maybe not animal welfare point of view, is a lot better. And also there's there's a disproportionate kind of meat overall that isn't all the way to plant-based to get you most of the climate benefit. You can go halfway and get most of the climate benefit actually, which is kind of great. The other is there's a disproportionate, like within a country, there's a disproportionate distribution of who eats all the beef. I don't remember the study, I can look it up and put it in the chat maybe, but there's a study recently pointed out that half of the beef consumed in the United States, for example, is eaten by 12% of the Americans. I'm like, oh my God, I want to meet these 12% and first ask, are you okay? Please sit down. And, how's your blood pressure? How's your cholesterol? Are you, what, and also how did you do it? I try to pencil out how much do you have to eat on a daily basis to consume half of the beef in America with only 12% of the people, but they managed to pull it off. But instead of, saying you have to become vegan, which I don't think is likely, it's more maybe addressing a health concern for people who are kind of super consumers of beef, which is a super polluter of carbon. You get two supers in a row right there. That to me sounds like a leverage point. And so when we talk about these commitments, I think we need to look at a spectrum of outcomes rather than, the world switches to vegan diets. That's very, very unlikely. But can we move the most important pieces of the puzzle a little bit to one side in the most effective ways by emphasizing not just the climate outcomes, but health, animal welfare, economic, etc. So I think some of that's lost in the nuance. The nuance is lost in these, binary labels we use, plant-based versus meat, and a commitment by a whole country. It's not the whole country that's the problem. So again, there might be some nudges in the right places could actually be pretty effective in addressing a lot of these issues and offer a lot of benefits to people. Let's not forget that we're not asking people to do something that's more unhealthy for them. It's actually healthier for them too, to cut back some maybe excessive levels of meat. And then don't forget the waste part too. Like when I talk to folks about cutting back on beef, like, well, maybe smaller portions, a little less frequently, and keep your leftovers. Make sure you don't throw that stuff away. And even the most ardent beef eaters I meet, anecdotally anyway, are like, oh, well, you're right about that. I shouldn't waste this stuff because it's very precious. I'm like, well, good, I got you halfway there. That's not bad. Reducing just the waste in that 40% of the beef that we waste in the world would be a big help too, as well as the diets. So there's a lot of little levers here that could be helpful.
Yeah, you're hitting on a lot of topics we reported on recently. So if
Yeah,
that's
yeah, you guys are
interest to
doing, you're on a
anyone,
tear.
yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, well, all those blockers are important to be thinking about. There was a question from a radio reporter that I thought was really important for reporters listening, of like, how do you, when you have these complex topics that you're both talking about, and I think as reporters, I know you get into the weeds of this and you want to really get the science right, and then you've got to sort of zoom back out and figure out how to explain it to people who are not in the weeds, and do it succinctly. And especially for audio, it's even more challenging. Like, you can't sort of go, here's an infographic that makes it easy for you. So do both of you have some sort of advice or things you'd like to kind of, maybe the more important points to hit? If you've got, I think the person said 40 to 50 seconds, what's kind of the big, points that really make resonate for someone who's interested in this issue, but is just listening in their car? What would you recommend reporters kind of include in the audio story on these complex topics?
Will I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
I think for me, this is something that I really got interested in sort of 2018 sort of timeline, and I'm still super interested in, and I found in my talks and even talking to very different audiences, so catering professionals, for example, in the food service industry, the thing that really seems to resonate and sort of sit with them is the kind of landscape level transformation element. So I think relating what we eat to everything around us and what we're really sort of missing in our environment as well. So in the UK, for example, we have 1% native forest cover, which is absolutely appalling. And it just means that most people probably have never been to a native forest in the UK. So I think when you put it into that kind of framing of how different our lives could be, and we would have all of this access to basically green and wild areas, that seems to put it into quite a different framing for people, rather than you can't eat beef, you've got to eat beans, that kind of situation. I think really broadening out the framing to the sort of natural landscape and biodiversity perspective seems to reach a different mindset.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Making it relatable. Food is so important, but also landscapes are so important to our identity, to our values, to our intergenerational perspectives of all these are the lands my parents and grandparents introduced me to, and I'm introducing them to my children and grandchildren, whatever. And a kind of stewardship of across generations is important, but also a culture and also kind of common sense things like, no, we're not coming for your steaks and hamburgers, but maybe, the doctor, the environmental folks and the scientists and your doctors are all saying maybe cut back a little and waste less of it. So it's just kind of common sense, not absolute, and be relatable. And that just all food's easy to talk about. We touch it 3 times a day, everybody. And so it's actually pretty easy and relatable compared to, chlorofluorocarbons or something like that. So shame on us if we can't talk about this in better ways. But I hope we can avoid the hyperpolarization that tends to get clicks, but not conversations. I know we're all fighting that in our different lives, but I applaud Sentient and others for trying to do that, and I hope you all do too. Just like, let's have a conversation, not a battle. And I may not get as many clicks on Instagram, but it's serving our fellow citizens very well.
Great. Well, I didn't plan to end on that, but it actually ended up being perfect.
Right. Well, thank you, Helen and John and Jenny, for this wonderful conversation. You will receive a follow-up email from me and everybody that attended today, probably by tomorrow, if not by Monday. I'll provide a link to this recording. And I'm also going to send you a survey so that you can weigh in on what topics you'd like us to cover from the Food and Farming Journalism Network in upcoming webinars. And of course, if you have any questions about joining the network, shoot me an email, Catherine@sentientmedia.org. And thank you everyone for attending today. Have a good day. Take care.